The dust never settled in Millbrook anymore. It just hung there in the air like the ghost of better times, swirling around empty storefronts and abandoned dreams. Once upon a time, this place had been something special, a bustling hub where cattle drives met merchant caravans, where fortunes were made and lost over poker games that lasted 3 days straight. But that was before the mines played out, before the cattle routes shifted south, before hope packed up and left town like everyone else. Now, Millbrook was dying, and everyone knew it. The population had dwindled from 2,000 souls to barely 300 diehards, who either couldn't afford to leave or were too stubborn to admit defeat. Main Street looked like a mouth with half its teeth knocked out. Every other building boarded up, weeds growing through the wooden sidewalks, paint peeling off storefronts like sunburned skin. The Copper Kettle Saloon still served whiskey to anyone brave enough to drink it, though the bartender had started watering it down to make the bottles last longer. Martha's General Store stayed open 3 days a week, mostly selling canned beans and false hope to the handful of ranchers still clinging to their land. The bank had closed 2 years ago, taking most folks' savings with it when the corrupt manager skipped town with what little money was left. But on this particular October morning, something different rode into Millbrook. Something that smelled like money and looked like salvation, wrapped up in a fancy black carriage pulled by horses that probably cost more than most people here made in a year. The man who stepped out of that carriage was everything Millbrook wasn't: clean, confident, and clearly prosperous. His name was Charles Whitmore, and he wore success like a tailored coat. His boots were polished to mirror shine, his mustache waxed to perfection, and his eyes held the kind of calculating intelligence that could spot opportunity where others saw only ruin. Whitmore had traveled here from the state capital with a singular purpose: to buy land, and lots of it, for prices so low it would be like stealing candy from desperate children. He'd done his homework, studied the maps, read the railroad surveys. The transcontinental railroad was coming, and when it did, sleepy little towns along its route would explode into booming cities overnight. The trick was getting in early, buying up property before anyone else realized what was about to happen. He'd pulled this same scheme in 3 other towns over the past 2 years, turning $1,000 investments into $100,000 payoffs when the railroad announcement went public. It was almost embarrassingly easy. Find a dying town, buy up the land for pennies on the dollar, wait for the railroad to announce their route, then sell to developers for massive profits. Millbrook was perfect for this kind of operation: desperate, isolated, and populated by people who'd probably sell their own mothers for enough cash to escape to somewhere with a future. Whitmore had already identified the key properties he needed: the old hotel that could be converted into a luxury accommodation for railroad executives, the stretch of land along what would become the main depot, the residential areas that would house the influx of workers and their families. His first stop was the mayor's office, though calling it an office was generous. Mayor Tom Bradley worked out of a cramped room above the general store, surrounded by ledger books that told the sorry story of Millbrook's decline in red ink and unpaid debts. Bradley was a thin, nervous man in his 50s who jumped at shadows and apologized for things that weren't his fault. Whitmore spread his maps across Bradley's desk like a general planning a campaign. He spoke in smooth, confident tones about development opportunities, infrastructure improvements, and economic revitalization. He painted pictures of a bright future where Millbrook would rise from its deathbed and become a thriving commercial center. Of course, he didn't mention the railroad. That was his little secret, the ace up his sleeve that would transform his modest investment into a fortune. Instead, he talked vaguely about emerging transportation opportunities and shifting trade patterns that suggested the region was poised for growth. Bradley listened with the desperate attention of a drowning man being thrown a rope. The mayor had been watching his town die for 5 years, helpless to stop the slow hemorrhage of people and prosperity. The idea that anyone, might want to invest in Millbrook seemed too good to be true. But Whitmore was persuasive, and he came bearing gifts. He offered to buy the old bank building for 3 times what anyone thought it was worth. He promised to purchase entire blocks of abandoned properties, paying cash up front, no questions asked. He even offered to settle some of the town's outstanding debts as a gesture of good faith. Word spread through Millbrook like wildfire. By noon, everyone knew about the mysterious businessman who wanted to buy up half the town. By evening, there was a line of property owners outside the hotel where Whitmore was staying, each clutching deeds and praying for deliverance. Sarah Mitchell was first in line. She owned the old newspaper building where the Millbrook Gazette had once printed the hopes and dreams of a thriving community. Now it housed nothing but mice and memories. She'd inherited it from her father, along with debts that kept her awake at night. Whitmore offered her enough money to pay off those debts and still have something left over to start fresh somewhere else. Next came Doc Harrison, whose medical practice had dwindled to treating the occasional broken bone or bout of fever. His building had good bones and a prime location on Main Street. Whitmore saw potential in converting it to a restaurant or shop once the development began. The doctor saw enough money to retire with dignity and maybe move somewhere warm for his arthritis. One by one, Whitmore worked through the line of desperate sellers. He was charming but businesslike, sympathetic but not sentimental. He understood that these people weren't just selling property. They were selling their past, their memories, their connection to a place that had once meant everything to them. But sentiment didn't pay bills or put food on tables, and Whitmore was offering something these folks hadn't seen in years: cold, hard cash. The negotiations continued for 3 days. Whitmore set up a temporary office in the hotel's dining room, spreading contracts and surveys across tables that had once hosted wedding receptions and town meetings. He moved methodically through his target properties, checking each acquisition off his list with the precision of a master strategist. Most sellers jumped at his offers, even though they were well below what the properties might have fetched in better times. These weren't better times, though, and everyone knew it. Whitmore wasn't taking advantage of their desperation. He was offering them a lifeline out of it. But there was one property owner who refused to bite. Old Henrik Larsen lived in a ramshackle cabin on the edge of town, a structure so weathered and worn it looked like it might collapse if you sneezed at it too hard. The cabin sat on a worthless piece of scrubland that most people wouldn't give away, let alone pay money for. Yet Whitmore wanted it, and he wanted it badly enough to offer Larsen 5 times what the property could possibly be worth. To everyone's surprise, the old man turned him down flat. Larsen was something of a mystery in Millbrook. He'd arrived about 15 years ago, just another drifter looking for work and a place to settle. He'd bought the cabin and its few acres for almost nothing from a widow who was eager to unload what she considered worthless land. Since then, he'd lived quietly on the outskirts of town, keeping to himself and bothering no one. People knew Henrik as a strange but harmless old-timer who occasionally came to town for supplies and always paid his bills on time. He was polite but distant, friendly but never quite friendly enough to be considered part of the community. Some folks suspected he was hiding from something, a criminal past, maybe, or debts that had followed him from wherever he'd come from before Millbrook. Henrik was tall and lean, with weathered skin and pale blue eyes that seemed to see more than they let on. His hair had gone completely white, though he couldn't have been more than 60. He moved with the careful precision of someone who'd spent years working with his hands, and when he spoke, it was with a slight accent that suggested European origins, though no one knew from where exactly. What people didn't know about Henrik Larsen was that he'd spent 35 years building railroads across the American West. He'd started as a laborer on the Central Pacific, hauling rails and driving spikes through the Sierra Nevada mountains. But Henrik had always been good with numbers, and he'd taught himself engineering by studying survey maps and gradient calculations by lamplight after 16-hour workdays. By the time the transcontinental line was completed, Henrik had worked his way up to chief engineer on several major projects. He'd built bridges across impossible gorges, carved tunnels through solid granite, and laid track across deserts where lesser men would have died of thirst. He understood railroad construction better than almost anyone alive, and more importantly, he understood railroad economics. Henrik knew that the success of any railroad line depended on more than just connecting point A to point B. It depended on having profitable stops along the way, places where trains could take on water and fuel, where cargo could be loaded and unloaded, where passengers could rest and resupply. The railroad companies studied these factors obsessively, using complex calculations to determine the most efficient and profitable routes. When Henrik had first arrived in Millbrook 15 years ago, he hadn't come here by accident. He'd come because his engineering experience told him this town sat at the perfect intersection of geography and logistics for a major railroad stop. The terrain was favorable for construction, there were reliable water sources nearby, and the location would break the journey between major cities at exactly the right intervals for maximum efficiency. Of course, 15 years ago, the Transcontinental Railroad had been a distant dream, and Henrik had been a burned-out engineer who'd saved enough money to buy a little piece of nowhere and disappear from a world that had asked too much of him. But he'd never forgotten his calculations, and he'd been quietly watching as political winds shifted and railroad fever began to sweep the nation once again. 3 months ago, Henrik had received confirmation of what he'd suspected all along. An old friend from his engineering days had written to warn him that railroad surveyors were working their way across the territory, and that the proposed route passed within spitting distance of Millbrook. Not only that, but the surveys showed that Henrik's seemingly worthless cabin sat on land that would become the primary depot for the entire region. That's when Henrik had begun his own quiet campaign of land acquisition. Working through a series of intermediaries and shell companies, he'd been secretly purchasing properties throughout Millbrook and the surrounding area. He'd been careful to spread the purchases out over time and use different names to avoid attracting attention to the sellers. These transactions looked like random real estate deals from various out-of-town investors. No one suspected that a single buyer was systematically acquiring a controlling interest in the entire town. Henrik had learned patience during his years in railroad construction. Building a transcontinental line required thinking in decades, not days. You had to plan for problems that wouldn't materialize for years, purchase supplies for projects that wouldn't begin for months, and trust that your calculations would prove correct long after you'd moved on to the next job. So, when Charles Whitmore arrived in Millbrook with his fancy carriage and smooth talk, Henrik wasn't surprised. He'd been expecting someone like Whitmore, a speculator who'd caught wind of the railroad rumors and hoped to profit from advanced knowledge. What Whitmore didn't realize was that Henrik's knowledge wasn't rumor or speculation. It was inside information from the best possible source, the engineers who were actually surveying the route. Henrik also knew something that Whitmore didn't: the exact location where the railroad would build its depot. Whitmore was operating on educated guesses and general assumptions about railroad logistics. Henrik had precise survey data that showed exactly which properties would become valuable and which would remain worthless. The irony was almost too delicious to bear. Here was this slick businessman, convinced he was running a sophisticated real estate scam on a bunch of ignorant rubes, when in fact he was being outmaneuvered by a man living in what looked like a chicken coop, but who possessed information worth millions. Henrik watched from his cabin as Whitmore worked his way through the town, buying up properties with the confidence of a man who thought he was the only one who knew the secret. The old engineer had to admire Whitmore's technique. The man was smooth, professional, and knew how to make people feel like they were getting a fair deal, even when they were being shortchanged. But Whitmore was making crucial mistakes. He was focusing on the obvious properties: the hotel, the main commercial buildings, the residential areas that looked like they'd be worth something if the town ever recovered. What he wasn't buying were the scrubby, seemingly worthless parcels on the outskirts of town that would actually house the railroad facilities. More importantly, Whitmore was being too aggressive, too obvious. His sudden appearance and willingness to pay above market prices was already generating talk and suspicion among the locals. If word got back to the railroad companies that speculators were operating in the area, they might choose a different route to avoid being squeezed by land prices. Henrik had no such concerns. His purchases had been so gradual and indirect that no one suspected a pattern. He owned nearly a third of the valuable land around Millbrook, but the ownership was buried under so many shell companies and intermediaries that even a thorough investigation would have trouble connecting the dots. When Whitmore approached Henrik about buying the cabin, the old engineer almost smiled. Here was this smooth operator offering 5 times the apparent value of a worthless piece of scrub land, thinking he was being generous to a desperate old man. If only he knew that the worthless land he was trying to buy would soon house the main railroad depot, freight yards, and passenger terminal for the entire region. Henrik's refusal to sell sent ripples of confusion through the town. Everyone knew his cabin wasn't worth much, and Whitmore's offer was more money than most folks in Millbrook saw in 5 years. Why would anyone turn down that kind of windfall? The speculation began immediately. Maybe Henrik was crazier than anyone thought. Maybe he was holding out for even more money, trying to squeeze extra profit from Whitmore's obvious desperation to acquire the property. Maybe there was something valuable on his land that nobody else knew about. Oil or minerals or buried treasure. None of these theories came close to the truth. Henrik wasn't crazy, greedy, or sitting on a secret natural resource. He was just a retired engineer who'd done his homework and was playing a much longer, much more sophisticated game than anyone else in town could imagine. Whitmore increased his offer. Henrik politely declined. Whitmore doubled it. Henrik thanked him for his generosity, but said he wasn't interested in selling. Whitmore tripled his original offer, an amount that would have made Henrik the richest man in 3 counties. Henrik smiled sadly and said he was too old to start over somewhere new, and his cabin meant too much to him to give up for money. The rejection drove Whitmore to distraction. In his previous operations, there had always been 1 or 2 holdouts, stubborn property owners who needed extra convincing or higher offers. But those holdouts had always owned valuable properties, prime real estate that was obviously worth fighting for. Henrik's cabin was genuinely worthless by any reasonable assessment, which made his refusal to sell completely inexplicable. What Whitmore couldn't know was that Henrik wasn't just refusing to sell the cabin. He was protecting an investment strategy that had taken 15 years to develop, and that would pay off in ways Whitmore couldn't imagine. Selling the cabin to Whitmore wouldn't just mean losing the most valuable property in his portfolio. It would mean revealing his hand to a competitor who might be able to piece together the bigger picture and threaten Henrik's entire operation. As the days passed and Henrik continued to refuse all offers, Whitmore began to suspect that something was wrong. His instincts, honed by years of successful speculation, told him that people didn't turn down life-changing money unless they had a compelling reason. And in Whitmore's experience, the most compelling reasons usually involved information that other people didn't have. Whitmore started asking questions around town. Had anyone seen surveyors in the area? Had there been any government officials asking about land use or mineral rights? Had anyone heard rumors about development projects or infrastructure improvements? The answers were all negative, but Whitmore's paranoia continued to grow. He began investigating Henrik's background, asking subtle questions about when the old man had arrived in Millbrook and what he'd done before settling there. The answers were frustratingly vague. Henrik had appeared 15 years ago with enough money to buy his cabin, but no one knew where the money had come from. He'd claimed to be a retired laborer, but he was clearly educated and knowledgeable about things that most laborers wouldn't understand. Most suspicious of all, Henrik never seemed to lack for money. Despite having no visible source of income, he paid his bills on time, bought supplies regularly, and even helped out neighbors when they hit hard times. Where was the money coming from? Was he getting payments from someone? Was he connected to some larger organization or conspiracy? Whitmore's investigation hit dead ends everywhere he turned. Henrik had covered his tracks too well, and Millbrook was the kind of place where people minded their own business and didn't ask too many questions about newcomers' pasts. But the more Whitmore dug, the more convinced he became that Henrik Larsen was hiding something important. The standoff continued for 2 weeks. Whitmore had successfully purchased most of his target properties, but Henrik's refusal to sell was like a thorn in his side that wouldn't stop festering. Every day he stayed in Millbrook, increased his expenses and his exposure to risk. Other speculators might get wind of the opportunity and move into the area. The railroad companies might announce their route early, driving up land prices before he could complete his acquisitions. But leaving without Henrik's property felt like admitting defeat, and Charles Whitmore had not built his fortune by accepting defeat easily. He decided to take a more aggressive approach. Whitmore began spreading rumors about Henrik around town. Maybe the old man was unstable, a danger to himself and others. Maybe he was sitting on land that contained environmental hazards or contaminated soil. Maybe there were legal questions about his ownership of the property that needed to be resolved. The goal was to create enough pressure and suspicion that Henrik would finally agree to sell just to escape the scrutiny. Henrik recognized what was happening, but he didn't take the bait. He dealt with much tougher customers than a Charles Whitmore during his years building railroads through hostile territory populated by claim jumpers, corrupt officials, and violent competitors. A smooth-talking speculator from the state capital was hardly worth worrying about. Instead, Henrik continued with his daily routine while quietly accelerating his own land acquisitions. Every day that Whitmore spent in Millbrook was another day closer to the railroad announcement that would transform the region. Henrik needed to secure as much property as possible before that happened, because once the news broke, prices would skyrocket beyond even his considerable resources. The chess match between the two men became the primary entertainment in a town that didn't have much else going on. Folks would gather at the Copper Kettle Saloon to speculate about what Henrik was really up to, and whether Whitmore would eventually give up and move on. Some people took sides, though most couldn't figure out which side they should be on. Sarah Mitchell, who had sold her newspaper building to Whitmore, found herself wondering if she'd made a mistake. Maybe Henrik knew something the rest of them didn't. Maybe there really was more to Millbrook's future than met the eye. But then she'd look at the cash Whitmore had paid her, real money that could buy real solutions to real problems. And she'd push those doubts aside. Doc Harrison had similar mixed feelings. He'd used Whitmore's money to pay off his medical school debts and set aside enough to retire comfortably. But watching Henrik's stubborn resistance made him wonder if patience might have been a better strategy than quick cash. Of course, patience was a luxury that few people in Millbrook could afford. Mayor Bradley tried to stay neutral, but the situation was putting him in an increasingly difficult position. Whitmore's investments had brought more money into Millbrook than the town had seen in years. But Henrik was a long-time resident who deserved protection from harassment or intimidation. The mayor found himself walking a tightrope between economic opportunity and community responsibility. The tension came to a head when Whitmore made one final desperate play. He approached the county sheriff and suggested that Henrik's mysterious background and suspicious behavior warranted official investigation. Maybe the old man was a fugitive from justice. Maybe he'd obtained his property through fraudulent means. Maybe he was involved in activities that threatened public safety. The sheriff, a practical man named Jake Morrison, listened to Whitmore's concerns with the skepticism they deserved. He'd known Henrik for 15 years, and while the old man was certainly private, he'd never caused any trouble or given anyone reason to suspect criminal activity. Morrison suspected that Whitmore's sudden interest in law enforcement was motivated more by frustration than genuine public concern. But Morrison was also politically astute enough to understand that Charles Whitmore was a man with money and influence, someone whose complaints might carry weight with the county supervisors who controlled the sheriff's budget. So Morrison agreed to have a conversation with Henrik, more as a courtesy to Whitmore than because he thought it was necessary. When Morrison knocked on Henrik's door, the old engineer welcomed him inside with the calm politeness of a man who had nothing to hide. The cabin's interior was sparse but clean, with a few pieces of simple furniture and shelves lined with engineering manuals and survey maps. Morrison noticed that the maps weren't local. They covered vast sections of the American West, marked with railroad routes and construction notes that suggested professional expertise rather than casual interest. Henrik offered coffee and answered all of Morrison's questions honestly. He'd worked for various railroad companies over the years, he explained, which was why he had the maps and technical manuals. He'd saved enough money to retire modestly, which was how he could afford to buy his cabin and live without visible employment. He chose Millbrook because it was quiet and peaceful, and he'd stayed because he'd grown attached to the place and its people. As for why he wouldn't sell to Whitmore, Henrik's explanation was simple. The cabin was his home, and he was too old and set in his ways to start over somewhere else. Money couldn't buy happiness or replace the comfort of familiar surroundings. He appreciated Whitmore's generous offers, but some things were more important than profit. Morrison found Henrik's answers completely reasonable and his demeanor entirely credible. The sheriff left the cabin convinced that Whitmore's suspicions were unfounded and that Henrik Larsen was exactly what he appeared to be, a harmless old man who valued his privacy and his independence more than money. But Morrison was wrong, of course. Henrik was neither harmless nor exactly what he appeared to be. He was a strategic genius, sitting on information that would soon make him one of the wealthiest men in the territory. The cabin that looked worthless to everyone else was actually the center of an investment empire that Henrik had been building for 15 years. Every night after Morrison's visit, Henrik would spread his own maps on the cabin's kitchen table and review his calculations one more time. The railroad surveys were definitive. The depot would be built on his land, the freight yards would stretch across properties he owned through shell companies, and the passenger terminal would sit on acres he'd purchased through intermediaries over the past decade. When the railroad announcement came, Henrik wouldn't just own a few valuable properties. He would control the infrastructure that made Millbrook's transformation possible. The railroad company would have to deal with him on his terms, or find a different location for their regional hub. And finding a different location would cost them millions more in construction and operational expenses. Henrik had learned long ago that the real money in railroad development wasn't in building the lines. It was in controlling the land where the lines had to go. Railroad companies might have armies of engineers and unlimited government backing, but they still had to negotiate with property owners for the specific pieces of ground their operations required. A smart landowner with advance information and strategic patience could name his price and get it. The end game was approaching, and Henrik could feel it in his bones. His contacts in the engineering community had indicated that the route surveys were complete and that official announcements would come within the next few months. When that happened, Charles Whitmore's modest speculation would be revealed as the small-time operation it really was. Whitmore might make a decent profit on his hotel and commercial properties, but Henrik would make the kind of money that legends were built on. Meanwhile, Whitmore was growing more desperate and erratic by the day. His investigation into Henrik had revealed nothing useful. His intimidation tactics had backfired, and his increasingly wild offers were being rejected without explanation. For the first time in his speculative career, Whitmore was facing the possibility that he might not get what he wanted, no matter how much money he offered. The psychological pressure was taking its toll. Whitmore had always succeeded through superior information and strategic thinking. He prided himself on being smarter and better informed than his competitors. But Henrik's inexplicable behavior suggested that someone else might have information that Whitmore lacked, and that possibility was driving him to the edge of panic. Whitmore began making mistakes. He started drinking heavily at the Copper Kettle Saloon, loosening his tongue about railroad rumors and development opportunities he'd previously kept secret. He made increasingly explicit hints about the reasons for his interest in Millbrook, giving away information that a smart operator would have kept confidential. The locals began to understand that Whitmore's investment wasn't just about helping Millbrook recover from its economic troubles. He was betting on something specific, something that would transform the region's economic prospects dramatically. And if Whitmore knew something that would make Millbrook valuable again, maybe Henrik knew something even more important. The speculation reached a fever pitch when someone remembered that Henrik had worked for railroad companies before retiring to Millbrook. What if the old engineer had inside information about rail development plans? What if his refusal to sell wasn't about sentimental attachment to his cabin, but about protecting a much larger financial interest? For the first time since arriving in Millbrook, Whitmore began to wonder if he was the one being played. The possibility that a shabby old man living in a ramshackle cabin might be running a more sophisticated operation than his own was almost too humiliating to contemplate. But the evidence was mounting that Henrik Larsen was not the simple retiree he pretended to be. Whitmore made one last desperate attempt to crack Henrik's defenses. He approached the old engineer directly, abandoning all pretense and laying his cards on the table. He admitted that he knew about the railroad development and that his entire investment strategy was based on advanced knowledge of the route announcements. He offered to make Henrik a full partner in his operation, splitting the profits from all their combined land holdings. Henrik listened to Whitmore's proposal with the patient attention of a man who'd heard similar offers many times before. When Whitmore finished his pitch, Henrik smiled sadly and shook his head. He thanked the younger man for his honesty and his generous offer, but explained that he was too old for business partnerships and too set in his ways to change his approach to life. What Henrik didn't tell Whitmore was that the partnership offer had come about 15 years too late. If Whitmore had approached him when he first arrived in Millbrook, they might have been able to work together. But Henrik had spent too many years building his position to share it with someone who'd shown up at the last minute with nothing but money and ambition. Besides, Whitmore's offer assumed that their interests were aligned, when in fact They were fundamentally different. Whitmore wanted to make a quick profit and move on to the next opportunity. Henrik was building something permanent, a legacy that would provide security for the rest of his life and beyond. Their time horizons, risk tolerances, and ultimate goals were incompatible. After Whitmore's final rejection, Henrik knew the game was nearly over. The younger man would either give up and leave Millbrook, or he would escalate his tactics in ways that might threaten Henrik's carefully constructed operation. Either way, Henrik needed to be prepared for the railroad announcement that would vindicate his strategy and reveal the true scope of his achievement. Whitmore chose escalation. If he couldn't buy Henrik out or partner with him, he would destroy the old man's reputation and force him out of Millbrook entirely. Whitmore began spreading increasingly wild rumors about Henrik's past, suggesting that he was a criminal fugitive, a dangerous radical, or a foreign spy. He lobbied the mayor and sheriff to take official action against Henrik, claiming that the old man's presence threatened the town's economic development. The campaign backfired spectacularly. The people of Millbrook had known Henrik for 15 years, and they resented an outsider's attempts to destroy the reputation of a harmless neighbor. If anything, Whitmore's increasingly desperate attacks made Henrik seem more sympathetic and Whitmore seem less trustworthy. Mayor Bradley finally told Whitmore to stop the harassment or leave town. Sheriff Morrison made it clear that any further unfounded accusations against Henrik would result in charges against Whitmore for disturbing the peace. Even the folks who had sold their properties to Whitmore began to distance themselves from him, embarrassed by his behavior and worried about their association with someone who seemed to be losing his grip on reality. Whitmore realized that he'd overplayed his hand, but by then it was too late to recover his reputation or his position in Millbrook. He'd been so focused on Henrik's refusal to sell that he'd neglected the relationships and goodwill that were essential to his long-term success in the community. Now he was seen as an untrustworthy outsider who'd tried to destroy a local resident for purely selfish reasons. The final blow came when Whitmore received word that railroad surveyors were working in the area, confirming what he'd suspected all along, but also indicating that the official route announcements were imminent. If he was going to complete his land acquisitions and position himself for maximum profit, he needed to act quickly and decisively. But Whitmore's reputation was now so damaged that property owners who had previously been eager to sell were having second thoughts. Maybe Henrik's refusal to deal with Whitmore meant the outsider couldn't be trusted. Maybe there were better offers coming from other sources. Maybe patience would be rewarded more handsomely than quick deals with a desperate speculator. Henrik watched Whitmore's self-destruction with the detached interest of a master craftsman observing an amateur's mistakes. The younger man had possessed real advantages, capital, connections, and accurate information about railroad development plans, but he'd lacked the patience and discipline necessary to execute a long-term strategy effectively. More importantly, Whitmore had underestimated his competition. He'd assumed that Henrik was just another ignorant local who could be bought or intimidated. He'd never considered that the old engineer might possess superior information, greater resources, and a more sophisticated understanding of railroad economics than his own. The final revelation came on a cold December morning when the territorial governor announced the official route for the Transcontinental Railroad. The line would pass through Millbrook exactly as Henrik had predicted 15 years earlier, with the main depot, freight yards, and passenger terminal located on land that everyone had assumed was worthless scrub. Within hours of the announcement, land prices in and around Millbrook increased tenfold. Properties that had sold for hundreds of dollars were suddenly worth thousands. But the really valuable land, the acres where railroad facilities would actually be built, was worth millions, and Henrik Larsen owned almost all of it. The scope of Henrik's achievement became clear as lawyers and surveyor teams descended on Millbrook to sort out property ownership and negotiation rights. Working through his network of shell companies and intermediaries, Henrik controlled not just his original cabin, but nearly 2,000 acres of prime railroad development land. The Transcontinental Railroad Company had no choice but to negotiate with Henrik on his terms. They could theoretically choose a different route, but that would mean abandoning years of survey work and millions of dollars in preliminary investment. Henrik had positioned himself as the indispensable man, the property owner whose cooperation was essential to the railroad's success in the region. The negotiations took 6 months and resulted in the largest real estate transaction in territorial history. Henrik sold some properties outright for astronomical prices, leased others for terms that guaranteed massive annual income, and retained ownership of key parcels that would provide ongoing revenue from railroad operations. By the time the deals were complete, Henrik Larsen had become one of the wealthiest men west of the Mississippi. Charles Whitmore's modest speculation proved profitable, but not spectacularly so. The properties he'd purchased increased in value, but they were secondary locations that served the railroad facilities rather than housing them. Whitmore made enough money to justify his investment and cover his expenses, but he didn't achieve the transformative wealth he'd hoped for. Charles Whitmore eventually left Millbrook, moving on to other speculative opportunities in other dying towns. He'd learned valuable lessons from his encounter with Henrik, but he never quite recovered from the psychological blow of being so thoroughly outmaneuvered. The experience had shaken his confidence in his own abilities and made him more cautious about assuming he was the smartest person in any given situation. Henrik, meanwhile, continued to expand his business empire throughout the region. He invested his railroad profits in banking, mining, agriculture, and manufacturing, creating a diversified portfolio that would generate wealth for generations to come. The old engineer had learned during his railroad construction days that infrastructure was the foundation of all prosperity. Roads, bridges, rail lines, and communication networks weren't just conveniences. They were the arteries that carried the lifeblood of commerce and civilization. By controlling key pieces of infrastructure, a smart investor could extract value from every transaction that flowed through the system. Henrik applied this philosophy to his post-railroad investments. He financed the construction of grain elevators that would store and ship the harvest from thousands of farms. He backed mining operations that would extract ore and ship it via his railroad connections to foundries and factories in distant cities. He established banks that would provide capital for the businesses and homesteaders flooding into the region. Each investment was carefully chosen to complement and reinforce the others. The grain elevators generated cargo for the railroad, which increased the value of Henrik's remaining railroad properties. The mining operations provided raw materials for the manufacturing businesses he was financing, creating vertical integration that maximized profits at every stage of production. The banks provided capital for all these enterprises while also generating revenue through interest and fees. But Henrik's greatest insight was understanding that wealth wasn't just about accumulating money. It was about building systems that would continue generating value long after he was gone. He wasn't just getting rich, he was creating an economic ecosystem that would benefit the entire region while ensuring his own family's prosperity for decades to come. The transformation of Millbrook accelerated beyond even Henrik's ambitious projections. What had been a dying town of 300 desperate souls became a thriving city of 15,000 residents within 5 years of the railroad's arrival. The main depot that Henrik had envisioned was processing more traffic than anyone had thought possible, and the commercial district he'd planned was expanding faster than buildings could be constructed. Henrik found himself in the unusual position of trying to slow down development rather than encourage it. Growth that happened too quickly could become unstable, creating boom and bust cycles that would ultimately harm the long-term prosperity he was trying to build. He used his influence to ensure that infrastructure development kept pace with population growth, that housing construction met reasonable standards, and that the city's expansion followed rational planning principles rather than speculative chaos. The irony wasn't lost on Henrik that he'd become exactly the kind of powerful figure he'd spent most of his life working for rather than with. During his railroad construction days, he'd been the employee implementing other people's visions and making other people wealthy. Now he was the visionary whose decisions affected thousands of people and whose success created opportunities for countless others. But Henrik wielded his power with the wisdom that came from having worked his way up from the bottom. He remembered what it felt like to be a laborer whose entire future depended on the decisions of distant executives who'd never swung a hammer or laid a rail. He tried to use his influence to create opportunities rather than exploit dependencies, to build systems that lifted everyone up rather than just concentrating wealth at the top. This approach made Henrik popular with the working people who'd flooded into Millbrook to take advantage of the opportunities the railroad had created. They recognized that the old engineer understood their struggles and aspirations in ways that most wealthy men didn't. Henrik paid fair wages, provided safe working conditions, and invested in schools and hospitals that served the entire community rather than just the wealthy elite. Henrik's reputation for fairness and community investment attracted even more businesses and residents to Millbrook. Entrepreneurs knew that Henrik's backing meant access to capital, infrastructure, and markets. Workers knew that Henrik's enterprises offered stable employment and opportunities for advancement. Families knew that Henrik's commitment to education and civic improvement made Millbrook a good place to raise children and build futures. The positive feedback loop accelerated Millbrook's growth beyond anyone's wildest expectations. The town that had been dying just a few years earlier was now being held up as a model of successful frontier development. Politicians pointed to Millbrook as evidence that American ingenuity and determination could transform any challenge into an opportunity. Business journals analyzed Henrik's strategies and tried to identify the principles that could be applied in other locations. But Henrik knew that his success couldn't be easily replicated because it had depended on a unique combination of circumstances that might never align again. The Transcontinental Railroad had been a once-in-a-generation infrastructure project that created unprecedented opportunities for those with the knowledge and patience to position themselves correctly. The specific geography and logistics that made Millbrook ideal for railroad development wouldn't be found in many other locations, and the 15-year time horizon that Henrik had been able to maintain was longer than most investors could sustain. More importantly, Henrik's success had required a depth of technical knowledge about railroad construction and economics that few other investors possessed. His ability to predict exactly where the railroad would locate its facilities hadn't been based on luck or generic business acumen. It had been based on decades of hands-on experience with railroad engineering and operations. Charles Whitmore's failure, by contrast, had resulted from relying on second-hand information and surface-level analysis. Whitmore had known that the railroad was coming, but he hadn't understood the technical factors that would determine exactly where the railroad would locate its most valuable facilities. He'd made educated guesses where Henrik had possessed precise knowledge, and that difference had been decisive. The story of Henrik's triumph and Whitmore's frustration became a cautionary tale about the importance of deep expertise versus superficial knowledge. Business schools would eventually teach case studies about the Millbrook land speculation, emphasizing how specialized knowledge could create competitive advantages that mere capital couldn't overcome. But in the immediate aftermath of the railroad announcement, the most obvious lesson was simpler. Patience and preparation could triumph over haste and desperation. Henrik had been willing to wait 15 years for his strategy to pay off, while Whitmore had expected quick results from a rapid-fire acquisition campaign. The difference in time horizons had been as important as the difference in information quality. Henrik's patient approach had also allowed him to build relationships and establish credibility in the community, advantages that proved crucial when the railroad negotiations began. The railroad company had been more comfortable dealing with someone they saw as a long-time local resident rather than an obvious speculator who'd appeared at the last minute. Henrik's reputation for fairness and community investment had given him negotiating leverage that pure property ownership couldn't have provided. As Millbrook continued to grow and prosper, Henrik began planning for the next phase of regional development. The railroad had been just the beginning. He could see opportunities for canal construction, telegraph lines, and eventually even electrical power generation that would create new waves of economic growth. Each new infrastructure project would create new investment opportunities for those with the knowledge and capital to participate. But Henrik was now in his 60s, and he recognized that he wouldn't live long enough to personally manage every future opportunity. He began training protégés and establishing institutions that could continue his work after he was gone. The bank he'd founded would provide capital for future development projects. The engineering firm he'd established would design and build the infrastructure projects he envisioned. The political relationships he'd cultivated would ensure that development proceeded according to rational plans rather than speculative chaos. Henrik also began writing detailed memoirs of his experiences, hoping that future generations could learn from his successes and mistakes. He wanted to preserve not just the story of what he'd accomplished, but the reasoning and methodology that had made his accomplishments possible. The knowledge he'd gained during 40 years of infrastructure development was too valuable to die with him. The memoirs revealed aspects of Henrik's character that even his closest associates hadn't suspected. Behind the quiet, unassuming exterior was a man of remarkable intellectual curiosity and systematic thinking. Henrik had studied not just engineering and economics, but history, geography, politics, and human psychology. He'd understood that successful infrastructure development required more than technical expertise. It required a deep understanding of how human societies organized themselves and evolved over time. Henrik had recognized that the transcontinental railroad wasn't just a transportation project, it was a civilization project that would determine how the American West developed over the following century. The decisions made about where to locate railroad facilities would influence where cities grew, where industries developed, and where millions of people chose to build their lives. By positioning himself strategically within that process, Henrik had been able to shape the development of an entire region while securing his own prosperity. The scope of Henrik's vision became clearer as Millbrook continued to evolve according to his plans. The city's layout, its economic base, its social institutions, and its connections to other regions all reflected principles that Henrik had established during the early years of railroad development. Even projects that were completed long after Henrik's direct involvement showed the influence of his original planning and the institutions he'd created to carry on his work. By the 10th anniversary of the railroad's arrival in Millbrook, Henrik Larsen had become a figure of almost mythical proportions. People told stories about the mysterious old engineer who'd outwitted a slick city speculator and transformed a dying town into a thriving metropolis. Children grew up hearing about Henrik's patience, wisdom, and community spirit as examples of the virtues that built successful societies. But Henrik himself remained remarkably modest about his achievements. He understood better than anyone that his success had depended on favorable circumstances, specialized knowledge, and a good measure of luck. Different timing, different railroad routes, or different political decisions could have rendered his careful planning worthless. He'd been prepared to capitalize on opportunities when they arose, but he couldn't claim to have created the opportunities themselves. Henrik's humility made him even more respected in the community he'd helped build. People appreciated that someone with his wealth and influence didn't lord it over others or claim credit for successes that had required the efforts of thousands of people. Henrik consistently emphasized that Millbrook's transformation had been a collective achievement, even though his individual contribution had been disproportionately important. The final chapter of Henrik's story was still being written as he entered his 70s. The institutions he'd built were functioning independently, generating wealth and opportunities for new generations of residents and investors. The city he'd helped plan was continuing to grow and evolve, adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining the fundamental strengths he'd built into its foundation. Henrik had achieved something that few businessmen ever manage. He'd created lasting value that extended far beyond his own financial interests. Millbrook's prosperity would continue long after he was gone, benefiting thousands of people who would never know his name or understand his contribution to their opportunities. And in his modest house, overlooking the bustling city that had grown from a dying town, Henrik Larsen could look back on a life well lived and a legacy that would endure for generations. The quiet engineer who'd refused to sell his ramshackle cabin to Charles Whitmore had become living proof that knowledge, patience, and strategic thinking could triumph over mere ambition and capital. The story of Millbrook's transformation became a template for successful frontier development, studied by planners and investors throughout the American West. But the deeper lesson of Henrik Larsen's achievement was about the power of expertise, preparation, and long-term thinking in a world that too often rewarded short-term speculation and superficial knowledge. In the end, the dying town's last secret had been that it was never really dying at all. It was just waiting for someone with the vision and patience to unlock its potential. Henrik Larsen had been that someone, and his success had created opportunities that would ripple outward for decades to come, transforming not just Millbrook, but the entire region around it. The ramshackle cabin where it all began still stood on the edge of town, preserved as a monument to the power of quiet determination and strategic thinking. Visitors could walk through the simple rooms where Henrik had studied his maps and calculated his investments, imagining the moment when a seemingly worthless piece of land had been revealed as the foundation of an empire. And somewhere in those rooms, if you listened carefully, you might still hear the echo of Henrik's patient voice, explaining to anyone who cared to learn that the greatest opportunities often came disguised as worthless scrubland, waiting for someone with the knowledge and courage to see their true potential